Saoirse, I last spoke to you on Near FM just over 3 years ago. I see that the Irish justice system is in the news recently because of overcrowding in Irish prisons. So I said to myself that it was time to get an update off you for our listeners today on Near FM. Saoirse, this may be a big question, but can you give me an overview, please, of where the issue of penal reform or lack thereof stands in Ireland today?
Yeah, so I suppose what we're seeing is a huge overcrowding problem right across our prison system. So last summer, July 2024, we hit a record 5,000 people in prison, and that would have been unheard of a few years ago. We never thought we'd reach that number. But actually, today, it's more like 5,500 people are in prison. And, what that means is that the prison system itself, staff are overstretched, but it also means that people are living in really unacceptable conditions. We were in Mountjoy recently, for example, and we went into the cells. We went into a cell with a single bed, which is pretty small in itself, but we then went into one with a bunk bed. Again, two people sharing that really small space, and when you think about it, it's a bunk bed with a toilet in the room as well and a desk, so very little floor space. But then we went into a third cell that had a mattress rolled up in the corner, but at night that mattress is put on the floor for somebody to sleep with their head beside the toilet. So whatever somebody might have done to end up in prison, that is the punishment. Going to prison is the punishment. The deprivation of their liberty is the punishment, not the conditions that they will then live in. And what we've seen, according to the most recent annual report of the Irish Prison Service that was published just last week, 3 out of 4 committals to prison are for 12 months or less. So that's for, less serious non-violent offences usually. And what we know from all the evidence from elsewhere and from Ireland as well is that if people commit an offence, and it's a less serious offence and they would be, sentenced to 12 months or less in prison, they do much better in the community. They serve their sentence in the community, under probation supervision, and they might engage in restorative justice, or it might be a community service order. But they're less likely to re-offend in the future. And really, that's what we want to see. And it means as well, with all those people going in and out of prison on those short sentences, they're never really dealing or addressing the underlying issues that might have caused them to commit crime in the first place. So, whether that's addiction, whether that's a mental health issue, whether it's, survival crime, because we have a housing crisis. There are a lot of people living in poverty. And that's not to excuse what anyone has done, but we need to understand it if we want to break this cycle. So that's what we would say. But on the other end of the scale, you have people in prison for very serious offences, for very violent offences, and they're not getting access to the rehabilitation programs that they need to actually change their behaviour, to prepare them for release in the future and make sure that, what we're seeing at the moment are lots of people ending up in prison, because of those underlying issues, like, whether it's mental health or addiction or poverty, or we're seeing an increase in the number of people going into prison who were homeless. So last year it was 11, nearly 12% of people going into prison said they had no fixed abode. So, this is all happening in a context where people don't have the supports that they need in the community. They're going into prison, they're, being put on waiting lists to access services in there, but they're out again before they get access to those services, and then they're back to the bottom of the list in the community, so they never get the help that they need. And then that also means that those people who are in prison for more serious offences, for violent offences, are getting access to the rehabilitation programs that they need to change behaviour, which, is essential when we think about it, because those people will be released one day, and we want them to be prepared for release, and we want them to have, seen the error of their ways and have changed behaviour. But at the moment, with overcrowding, prison schools have to close sometimes because there aren't enough staff to open them. It means the gyms close, and that is a real outlet for people, particularly those who might be on a waiting list for addiction support, and are going cold turkey. Like, people have told us in prison how important that is for them to have access to the gym, to other recreation facilities like the yard, for example, to be able to go outside and do exercise there, to education and training programs. So it has a knock-on impact. And then family visits as well sometimes. Thankfully, not very often, but sometimes they are cancelled because of staff shortages. And these are all things that help protect people against reoffending, because they help them change behaviour. They support them in their journey towards, dealing with the reasons why they offended in the first place. So things have changed quite a lot. But, last year IPRT did commission Red C to do a public attitudes poll in advance of the election to see where the public stood on a lot of this. And it was very clear from the public's point of view that they don't think that building more prisons is the answer to tackling crime. Actually, what they focused on were, not surprisingly, 41% of people, when they were asked, if you were given €10 million to spend on tackling crime, what would you spend it on? 41% of people said more guards. But then the second and third answers were really interesting from our perspective, because number 2 was drug treatment with continuing care for 2 years to actually help people address their issues. And then number 3 was youth work. So, people realised that investing in person-centred approaches to tackling crime is much more effective than prison spaces and making more prison spaces, which was actually, well done the list at number 5, I think. So, I think the public have an understanding of that. We are seeing the Minister for Justice talking about focusing more on community-based sanctions, and that is really welcome. But we need to see legislation progressed in that instance to provide judges with more options other than just sending people to prison, because we know that isn't working for, so many people who go in there for short periods of time.
I think, just to go back for a minute, I think the issue of overcrowding in Irish prisons and the issue of some people with serious mental illnesses getting sent to prison, I think they're just two disgraceful issues. And you've already kind of answered a couple of questions I was going to ask you, but as regards, I think is it 3/4 of prisoners that get sent to prison every year to actually sent there for less than a year. So I'm just wondering, what alternative sentences or punishments would they have, in your point of view, if they weren't going to prison?
Yes. So instead of going to prison, there are a few options that are currently available to judges, and that's community service orders. So that might be helping out in your community. It might be that you have to attend what's called a community-based organisation, and they have particular types of work for you to do. So it could be, scrubbing graffiti off a wall. It could be getting involved in the Tidy Towns initiative. It could be, doing some administrative work, and then there are specialised programs as well with particular groups of people. And that not only helps people kind of, pay back the community in a way, but there's a financial cost to that as well. I think the probation service estimates that, over €2 million a year goes back in to communities through that unpaid work, which is really welcome. But it also helps people make connections with the community, which means that they feel part of it. Because very often, the people might have, underlying issues. They mightn't feel part of something. They mightn't feel like they belong. And, particularly those people with mental health issues or addiction issues, they need to feel a sense of community, really, to help change the way they've behaved before, perhaps. So that's really useful. Restorative justice is another way that people can, repay their debt to the community, if you want to put it like that. But restorative justice is where, with the consent of the person, the victim of the crime, they might sit down with the perpetrator and have a chat about, why it happened. They talk about their perspectives. And the probation service have used a really useful example, I think, of where this has worked well. So there was an older couple whose house was broken into, and it was by a young man, and they decided they would engage in a restorative justice exercise with him. and they sat down with him. And so the older couple, they felt like they had been targeted deliberately, that they had been picked. And, that really had an impact on their mental health and, their kind of anxiety levels, as you can imagine it would. But when they sat down with that young man, they talked about, he explained to them it was random. He didn't, he hadn't been watching them. He didn't target them deliberately. It was just on the day he did this. It was impulsive. So that kind of helped them think, right, that makes us feel a bit better and more secure in our home. But then when they talked to him about, the reasons why he might have been involved in this kind of behaviour, they realised, obviously, he had his own issues and he had experienced childhood trauma, and again, not excusing it, but it helped them understand it to the point where they actually developed a relationship with that young person and, started going to his football matches and actually being a champion for him. So I'm not saying it's going to be effective in every case, but it can be effective in some cases. And then judges being able to, defer sentences, look at other ways to see if people can engage in drug treatment, for example. The drug treatment court is there. It's next door to IPRT. It's in Green Street. And people go in there and they enter a program, and basically they don't go to prison, they're diverted from prison if they engage in the program and actually, keep up, kind of go into the appointments that they have, and the judge can see that they're making progress and they have to come back and answer to the judge. But at the moment that's only really there for people who are in prison for drug related offences, but actually those might be quite small in number, whereas a lot of crime is actually driven by addiction. So if you widened out the remit of that court, if you had it in places other than Dublin, then that could actually be a really useful way to divert people from prison, get them the help that they need. They might never see the inside of a prison cell because it's dealt with their underlying addiction. And then, on the mental health side, we know that there is a program in Clover Hill. It's called the Prison in Court Liaison Service. And it's diverted 2 prison loads of people from Clover Hill with mental health issues and gotten them the treatment that they need in the community and supported them to get housing if they need it. And, so diversion is a really important way to help people address their issues, to be sanctioned in a way. And, people will often receive a sentence and a conviction. But they, ultimately, it'll help them stop reoffending in the future. And that's what we all want to see. We don't want to see our prisons overcrowded. Nobody wants to see that. Nobody wants to see people going in and out of prison and continuing to offend. We want people to deal with their issues and actually, increase public safety. That's what everyone wants. And so we don't think that, building more prison spaces is the answer. We believe investing in communities, investing in community services, and looking at alternatives to prison is a better way to invest our money, and smarter, because at the moment, prison is really expensive. To keep one person in prison for a year is almost €100,000 a year. Whereas if somebody serves their sentence in the community or goes, has probation supervision of some sense, that's less than 10% of that cost, and it's more effective. So to us, it's a no-brainer, really.
You mentioned community services there, or as I would call them, at the same time, public services. And there's also education and I think the social protection system in general, because I think the issues of trauma and alienation are huge to crime, not just people who get caught for doing criminal instances, but even teenagers with antisocial behaviour on the weekends. I think I think most of it is probably fueled through drugs as well. The trauma and alienation are huge issues to a lot of people, aren't they?
They are, and I think you've touched on a few things there, Darren, in terms of the education piece. If you look at the stats, and the Irish Prison Service do collate this information now, but the average age of school leaving for somebody in prison is 14. So people are dropping out of school. they're not engaged in the education system. And that tells you that, and, very often they're from, communities that experience deprivation and, and disadvantage anyway. They might be from the traveller community, they might be from areas of deprivation, they might be, all of those things. But I suppose the key is that our education system doesn't, fit every child. Like, there are things called alternative education projects, and those can be better suited. Not everyone's academic in the same way. Some people have different strengths. And that piece around trauma, like our current education system doesn't always deal with people's trauma and, leads to people dropping out of school, not being engaged. And youth work is really important in this instance as well. Like, we have a lot of investment at the moment in youth diversion, which is really welcome. But we need to take a step back and actually look at youth work and, how youth workers engage with young people where they're at and, provide them with alternatives as well. So, investment in those types of services is really important. And like, again, when we think about young people, like, we know that young people can impulsive and don't understand the consequences of their actions. Again, not excusing that behaviour, but we need to understand it to address it. And it is something that, we see time and time again. The lack of investment in youth work has had implications for this. The lack of investment in alternatives to education plays a huge part in it. And then very often you end up with people going to prison who are re-engaging in education and actually welcome that opportunity. But at the moment, with the overcrowding situation, you end up with people with the schools closed and, them not being able to avail of that educational opportunity. So that is a real lost opportunity for them as well. So I think, it is about, like, I always say, like, I come from a children's rights background, and people kind of went, well, why did you go into penal reform? Because I see the links. That's why. Because, the trauma that somebody might experience as a child or a young person might have lifelong consequences for them. And, I've been in Mountjoy and other prisons, but I always remember talking to somebody in Mountjoy, and they said, look, when I was sentenced for what I did, the judge said to me, oh, well, sure, what did you expect if you got involved in the drugs trade? And I said, well, it wasn't that I got involved in the drugs trade. It's that, it was all around me. I thought it was normal to smoke a joint at 12, and I progressed from there. So it wasn't a choice on my part. It was, my reality. So, the justice system needs to understand that as well. And in fairness, the Department of Justice have put in place some progressive measures. They have put forward recommendations under the Mental Health and Addiction Task Force. They put forward quite a number of recommendations, and, we are starting to see some of those being implemented now. So, for example, there is a dual diagnosis lead for mental health and addiction in prisons now, but there's still not enough staff to deal with the mental health issues and the addiction issues that we're seeing in prisons. So, for example, there's only 3 addiction specialists right across the prison estate, or there were last year in 2024, and I'm not sure if that's changed or not, but it won't have changed that much. We need better investment in those services, to ensure that people can actually tackle their issues.
Just thinking of them, the two people now, you probably know them more than I do. I have interviewed them a couple of times, but I have heard Peter McVerry and Andrew Montague, in his capacity for Dublin City Council report for Ballymun, speak on the issue of trauma and addiction, because the two issues really are, I think, side by side. Do you think so, do you?
Yeah, and Peter has been very strong on this as well, in terms of that lack of investment in the services that are needed for prison. And again, like the homelessness issue, it isn't a coincidence that we have a prison overcrowding crisis that coincides with the mental health crisis, that coincides with the housing crisis and a cost of living crisis. These all go hand in hand. So unless you address some of those issues, I'll give you an example. Like, we've heard of a woman who was sentenced to 2 weeks in prison, but, you do get released sooner than that, and particularly at the moment, the Irish Prison Service are making decisions about, people getting out in early release if it's a less serious crime. And, last year, for example, there were 1,000 people who served less than 24 hours in prison. And that puts a lot of pressure on the system, because you still have to be admitted, you still have to get a bed, you still have to do all of that. But we've heard of a woman who went into prison. I think she was sentenced for 2 weeks. She served 5 days, but by the time she came out of prison, she'd lost her temporary accommodation. Now, what we need to see are those pieces, or those dots joined up, because if there's going to have that knock-on impact, and then that person is walking out the gates of prison, looking left or right and going, well, where do I go tonight? That is a concern for that person, for that individual, but also, what's going to happen then in the future? Like, if they have to rely on, on friends that they were engaging with before, when they're trying to maybe get away from addiction or deal with their mental health issue, and that would have had a negative impact on them, then we're not really helping them to do that if we're not putting those supports in place. Like, nobody should be released from prison without knowing where they're going, not just that night, but on a medium-term basis, But because of the pressure on the system, those plans can't be put in place for people who are there for very short periods of time. So, there is so much that we could do that would be more progressive and would be more effective than, simply locking people up for short periods of time, when that's going to do them more damage. It's going to exacerbate any trauma that they did feel. It's going to have an impact on their mental health and well-being. And we know this particularly for women. There are higher rates of self-harm. For those who are on remand, who haven't been convicted of a crime, but are awaiting trial, they suffer higher rates of self-harm as well. So we need to think about the people at the centre of this, and understand why they've done what they've done, but how do we actually help them to change?
Okay, Saoirse, it's great talking today. Just to come towards the end of the interview, you mentioned that there are some positive changes in progress. Speaking of the Irish government and the Department of Justice, the Minister for Justice, all these relevant people, can you tell me, are there any new changes of policies that we can expect to see in a few months, or if I'm talking to you, for example, this time next year, do you think, can you imagine there'd be much difference, or will we still talk about the same kind of things, or what do you think?
We would hope so. There's a few things in the pipeline. So, for example, there's a temporary release scheme for women serving sentences of 18 months or less down in Limerick. And, there was investment in that. It was set up last year. It's still working, so we would hope to see further investment in that. One of the things that's really effective in the youth justice scheme is a bail support scheme. So this is where, the person, the judge can decide that the person will engage in this bail support scheme, and they will engage with therapeutic services, wraparound services around that person to deal with any underlying trauma, to deal with any addiction issues, with mental health issues, with, aggression or anger management, all of those things. And so there is talk now of a pilot scheme for women in the first instance that we would hope would then be extended to, say young men, 18 to 24, and then moving on from there if it's effective. But, all the evidence would say that they are. And it means that, the services are meeting people where they are and helping them deal with any issues that they might have. So, that's positive. The Minister has brought forward legislation that, will be going through, certainly going to the Justice Committee of the Oireachtas before Christmas, we believe and understand, around expanding community service orders, and that those could apply for sentences of 24 months or 2 years or less. So, that would hopefully widen that net. Dealing with the remand issue, we would hope that IPRT are going to be doing research on that to look at what the reasons why the remand rates are so high, because it's currently 1 in 5 people in prison. So about 1,000 people in prison are there in remand. And fine, some of them might need to be there for, particular reasons, but not all of them. And we do hear about affordability of bail being an issue for people experiencing poverty. So we would hope to see those, but we would also hope to see, more progress, like in terms of, say, for example, prison as a last resort being put into law, that principle, being put into law. It is for children, but we would like to see it for adults, because that will mean that, hopefully when somebody comes before the court, that the judge will kind of make a decision on whether or not this really is a last resort. And the legislation I mentioned around community service orders, the judges will now have to, if it comes to pass, the judges will have to, give a reason for why they would choose custody and prison over somebody serving a sentence in a community. So those are all positives. And, we've met with the Minister for Justice, and he said he does understand there are people in prison for, less serious offences, and that is something that he would like to kind of deal with, and that's why he's bringing forward that legislation. But there's other legislation that he could do to widen the range of options for judges, to ensure that they can have a range of different options instead of prison, and that would be really welcome. And then, there is another thing that we would really love to see is reform of the Inspectorate of Places of Detention. So there is legislation there that would help us ratify an international treaty that we first signed 18 years ago that would help monitoring in the prisons to kind of make sure that inhumane and degrading treatment doesn't happen in those prisons. And it would reform the Office of the Inspector of Prisons and give them more power to publish their own reports, for example. Because at the moment, the Minister has to publish those reports. And, what we need is transparency and accountability in the system to make sure that it is working for those people who are in there, both in terms of the people who've been sent to prison, but also for staff, and make sure that, the spotlight is shone on those human rights aspects of prison as well. So, yeah, we will be hopeful that we will see some of that. We'll see what Budget 2026 brings as well. We would hope to see investment in some of those things I've mentioned that would really help address the overcrowding situation in the short to medium term, rather than waiting 5 years for more prison spaces to be built that will then just be filled straight away. We won't build our way out of the overcrowding crisis.